Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I know I just boomed the mic. I hope that just blew your eardrums out. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am getting to the end of a day of long filming, trying to get all this content to you guys. So, thoughts and prayers for me. Actually, no, not really, because by the time you get this, it's going to be so long removed from my recovery of this day that it's not even going to be of any use. So, thanks a lot for not giving me thoughts and prayers when it could have made a difference, and you didn't have any instruction on when to do that. Sometimes you guys should just pray for people, just because you never know why that would be the case. Anyway, beyond the random rambling that had just taken on, that is obviously due to the lack of sleep. Today we are getting into a fun topic that should explode the comment section into massive fights, because that seems to be what ends up happening. No, we are not doing old Earth versus young Earth creationism. However, one of these days we will, because I just every now and again I like to get some popcorn and go into the comment section and be like, how is everybody showing the world their good Christian witness? And I'm never disappointed. You guys do a wonderful job there. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic, but not actually, because some of you actually do a wonderful job in the comment section, being nice and respectful with what you're saying, and some of you, yeah, it is what it is. But quick drink of water there. We're going to get into atonement theory today, all right? So I'm not going to belabor it too long. This is a debate on penal substitution, all right? William Lane Craig, again, one of my favorite Christian apologists, coming down in the positive. Gregg Boyd coming down in the negative. Now, if you don't know what atonement theory is, all right, there's a lot of them. Most of us have only ever heard of penal substitution, but that certainly is not all of the theories. There is penal substitution, and in a broader than penal substitution would be satisfaction theory, which is first kind of posed by Anselm the monk. But what else do we have, you may ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. Here we go. We have the Christus Victor theory, which I won't get into the details of. We may in a minute. Yet Christus Victor. You have the moral influence theory. You have bait and switch models, governmental models. You have recapitulation, Irenaeus, who comes up with that ransom theory, which was first posed by Origen of Alexandria. And basically, all of these are trying to explain the meaning of the cross to some degree, and some other things as well. You know what I say? I've noticed this to some degree. I say that a lot, so I apologize if I say to some degree too much. More often than you normally hear it, but they are trying to explain the atonement. The atonement's trying to explain the atonement. They're trying to explain the meaning of the cross. Some other things as well, but mainly, why did Jesus have to die? Was it for substitutionary purposes? Did he take our place? And was it for the wrath of God that was going to come to us, comes to Jesus, and he becomes a substitute for us? Is it because he becomes a ransom for sin and pays a ransom to the devil? That's ransom theory, to free us from our sin. Is it moral influence? Is it that he provides us a narrative and a story that us who love our sin, who are enslaved to sin, can look at the perfect example of perfection that Jesus lived and aspire to that idea and break our way out of sin? That's another theory. That's not necessarily that's a little bit of a caricature of moral influence. Is it recapitulation? Does he become the new Adam for us, which is what Irenaeus would have posed? So there's a lot of that, but right now we're looking at penal substitution, which has been a much issue of debate for quite some time. But let's see how they come down on this, Gregg Boyd and William Lane Craig.
Gregg, you've written this. You've said that penal substitution makes it look as though God had to vent his wrath on Jesus in order to forgive us. Right. So for you, you do feel that this doesn't paint God the right way, this way of looking at substitution.
It's interesting. Let me first say that I also agree that the atonement's multifaceted, and I appreciate the table. I have never heard that before, that core thing there, and that's what I would put Christus Victor. I think that is what makes sense of the whole and informs the parts, and that's probably where we disagree. The thing is, what Bill just said on penal substitution, and this was kind of the strange part when I'm reading this book, is that I would be classified a penal substitution theorist, because while I frame it differently, I believe that Jesus stood in our place. and bore the death consequences of sin that we deserved. And that's how we're reconciled with God. The only part of it I've ever really had a problem with is the idea that retributive justice is an essential attribute of God, that all sin must be punished. And this goes to the legal framework again. When I talk about us or Jesus bearing the death consequences of sin, that is what I think is the punishment of God, the judgment of God. It's the wrath of God that Paul talks about in Romans 1. He says the wrath of God has been revealed from heaven. And then it says 3 times says that God delivered them over to their reprobate hearts and all that. And so I see God in his mercy as hanging with us, saying, don't go down this road because it naturally leads to death. This way of going, God is life. And so sin is rejecting God. So sin is death. You're going down a death road. And God in his mercy tries to hang on to us, saying, don't go down that road. But there comes a point where if he sees his mercy is just enabling us, then God says, I have to turn you over and suffer the consequences of this. And that is, I think, the essence of the judgment of God. So I frame it all more in organic terms rather than legal terms. But if the appeasing God's wrath is not part of it, then we can still discuss the different meanings of this. But we're not as far apart as I thought we were going to be.
Well, that's
Okay,
very
so-
interesting to hear. But maybe
Because we came in a little bit late into this video, but to give a little context on that, and he just said Christus Victor, so I would assume that's kind of the atonement theory that is it Gregg Boyd? It is Gregg Boyd, that Gregg Boyd holds to. Basically, they were discussing the cross and our sin being put on the shoulders of Christ and the suffering of Christ, and the only real distinction that's being pointed out here is that Boyd is saying, oh yeah, I affirm that Christ had to go to the cross. I affirm that it was painful. He took on the sins of the world, but I don't think it was because he took it on because basically the wrath of God, right? God's here, we're here, wrath is coming at us, like this, and Jesus stands in the middle of that and takes all the wrath, right? He doesn't think that it's coming from God, right? He thinks the consequences of sin are more natural. So, for instance, if we sin, we separate ourselves from God, and we follow down a path of death, right? The wages of sin are death. So Jesus takes the natural consequences of sin from us by paying those wages, but those aren't wages necessarily that God is requiring to be paid. They're wages of the natural order of things, an outgrowth of free will. And in Christus Victor, which is really a lot of times confusing, it's hard. I've done some work on Christus Victor, but there's differing approaches to it. And N.T. Wright has some interesting views that kind of help to illuminate it a little bit. And by the way, one thing I would like to say, no matter what atonement theory you hold to, most of these theories are a facet to some degree, right? Even if you're a PSA person, which just means penal substitutionary atonement, most of them wouldn't disagree with Christus Victor or recapitulation or even moral influence, by the way, which a lot of people mock, but they'd say, yeah, moral influence is a part of it. There's a lot of harmony that they put together in all these specific theories. But in the Christus Victor model, a good example of this, there's a video on YouTube that I would recommend watching that explains it like this. Martin Luther King Jr., right? He's fighting for civil rights, but he's killed, right? Because he's killed, there's this explosion in the cause of civil rights, right? He becomes the martyr of that cause, and the cause of civil rights is advanced and cemented into law, right? And now what he was working towards has become a reality. But through his death, even though it seems counterintuitive, right? He's dying, but his death produces the victory. So that's kind of a Christus Victor model. It's a rescue operation. He comes to rescue us from our sin, from our death, from all of that. And but through his death, right, he gains the victory over sin. Now, what the exact function of that is, sometimes that can get a little murky. Now, penal substitutionary atonement, obviously different than that, and more of the theory that there's God hates sin, right? We're sinners, therefore God demands a penalty to be paid for our sin, right? And Christ becomes that penalty for our sin. He takes it on himself. God's wrath is directed towards him, and because of that, we can come in under Christ, right? We can be declared righteous because we're not responsible for our sin. Now, what critics of this view will point out is in the Old Testament, there's all these verses that are very explicit about, right? The innocent is not to pay for the guilty, right? These in more human law. And PSA people will say, yes, but that's only for humans. God can do whatever he wants, right? But and then we get into some arguments and debates of that. If you guys are really interested, a great series is Warren McGrew's series with Paul, I'm going to mess his name up, Paul Venderi or something. I can't remember his name. 17 parts on a reaction to Mike Winger on PSA. I would recommend that if you want to go a little bit deeper in kind of the critiques of PSA. But that's kind of where we at. And Gregg Boyd doesn't really disagree much with Craig, and again, that's going to be a function of the fact that a lot of these models are closer together than what most people realize. And you've probably sat through sermons where your pastor, who is a PSA advocate, has probably taught the Christus Victor model or given an illustration, or given a moral influence illustration, or a ransom theory. You hear it in songs and all sorts of things. That's just because it's a multifaceted thing that the atonement did. But that's a little brief discourse on that, and let's get back to it.
Maybe it would help to tease out some of these terms Gregg is using here. Appeasing God's wrath. Firstly, what do you take to be the meaning of God's wrath? I did mention that well-known line from In Christ Alone. On the cross as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. What does that mean to you, Bill?
Yeah. Well, I do think that God is incensed with sin. If God were not angry with evil, he would be indifferent to the plight of all the victims of sin and injustice. And so I think that it's quite proper that a righteous God would be angry when evil is done and people are victimized. And he's not a callous, unfeeling, impassible God, I think. But at the root of God's wrath, I think, lies this notion of retributive justice. It's not just that he's angry, rather it is that his holiness and justice cry out for the just desert of sin, which is, I think, death. Death is both a consequence of sin, as Gregg explained, but in the Old Testament, it's also a punishment for sin. All the way back into the story of the Garden of Adam and Eve, you have this legal terminology that indicates that sin is a capital crime that deserves death. So sin is both, or rather death is both a consequence of sin in this organic sense, but it's also a punishment for sin in the legal sense. And we mustn't attenuate our theology by eliminating these multiple facets. They're all part of the big picture, and we neglect any one of them to our detriment.
Gregg, quick response before we go to a break.
I'll try. See, it seems to me, I would agree with that. I think it is consequence of sin. I think it's the punishment of sin. And I agree that it's expressed sometimes in judicial categories, but I think it's more fundamentally expressed in organic categories.
Right.
But the organic seems to me to be the more fundamental. For example, if you're speeding and you break the law, well, then you get a fine. Okay, it's imposed on you. That's a judicial punishment, the legal punishment. But if you're speeding, going down a hill that has got a sharp curve at the bottom, and you, because you're speeding, don't make that curve and end up getting in a crash and getting injured, maybe killed. Well, see, that's an organic punishment, an intrinsic punishment, because there's no connection between the fine and speeding. But there is a definite connection between going down this hill, speeding, and getting in a crash. And it seems to me that the reason you have the law is to warn people about the organic reality. The law is not the more fundamental thing, I don't think. It's in service to this reality. Do this, and it ends up in death. And so I just don't weight the legal terminology the way Bill does.
Okay.
I thought I was too big.
All right, there we go. We're gonna get a. Let me mute that. We're gonna get an ad here. One
This is
thing
a
I
long
actually
language,
think
but
would
as you can
be
see,
something that we could
I like to make the most of my time.
would be at least a helpful
Me gustan los
allegory for what's being
I
said.
think it's just
Over here. Let me unmute that. All right, will be a helpful allegory for what Boyd just said here is this. All right, imagine you're standing in a road, or you see someone standing in a road, right? And that person in the road is completely oblivious to a car that's about to hit them, all right? That car is coming 70 miles an hour. They don't know they're going to get hit. It's a definite fact they're going to get hit because they don't know about the car coming, right? Or maybe they do know about the car coming and they don't care, but they're going to be on the road, right? Jesus jumps in front of the car and takes the hit of the car, right, in our place. We deserved to be hit. In fact, I'd actually go even further than that. I'd say we're on the road because we want to be on the road, right? And we're not leaving the road, right? Jesus jumps in front of the car, takes our place, right? The question's going to be, who's driving the car? In Gregg's model, God is driving the car, right? God is driving the car towards us to give us what we deserve. In Boyd's model, just the organic penalty of us being on the road. Nothing's driving the car. The car's just there. It's going to hit us because we're in the middle of the road, right? It's just the natural consequences of being in the middle of the road. Now, we're still indignant regardless. We want to be on that road even though we're not supposed to be. But who is driving the car, right? What's driving the car? And Jesus still sacrifices himself for us in both models of that, but it's a different form of sacrifice a little bit, right? He takes our punishment, but who is exacting the punishment? Who's requiring the punishment, right? That's why, by the way, PSA has been very unpopular recently. And in more of an ancient, if you go back to ancient history, you can find bits and pieces that seem like Chrysostom has a little bit of an excerpt or a pericope that looks a little bit like PSA, but at the same time, when you read Chrysostom carefully, I just don't think you can come down on PSA from his model. It is true that penal substitutionary atonement is just not all that present in the first several centuries, many centuries of the Christian Church. What they articulate looks more like a Christus Victor model, and then Origen, the ransom theory, comes out, but certainly it becomes way more popular when not just what Anselm proposes, kind of the more hardline understanding of it, and then the reformers really pick it up, and then we really start to get this penal substitutionary atonement idea that just starts to permeate. And that's why most of us have never even heard of any other atonement theories. So we do need to understand basically who is driving the car. That's what I'd sum it up to, right? That's going to be the differences between these two systems, right? And it's going to be fair to figure out how we parse that out.
It's indisputable that Paul's theology is suffused with legal terminology and the imagery of the courtroom. This is also prominent in the Old Testament. Old Testament Judaism was a religion of law. Law and ancient Judaism are virtually synonymous. So these legal categories and legal motifs suffuse Judaism, and they pervade the book of Romans in Paul's doctrine of both justification and sin. And so we can't downplay these legal categories that we have sinned, deserve to be punished for our sins, and that through the intervention of Jesus Christ, he has satisfied the demands of divine justice, thereby freeing us from our condemnation and liability to punishment.
We'll go to a quick break and we'll be back in just a
Right,
moment.
so
You're unbelievable. We're talking about
As
atonement
they're
theory
going to
today,
a
specifically
quick
penal
break,
substitutionary.
we're going to move on.
In terms of what Bill's representing, you're just framing it
Right,
slightly
here we go.
differently, and you could even call yourself a penal substitutionary atonement sort of theorist if it was framed
I
right.
would fit under some of the descriptions that the variety that Bill lays out. And I was also surprised at how broad that was. Okay, so Bill said it just before the break that Jesus died to, I don't know exactly how you phrase it, but to appease or to satisfy the Father's wrath. And he uses that throughout the book. And that's the part, it alters your picture of God. It generates a number of difficult questions. Bill does as good a job as I can be done in trying to answer these questions, like how is Jesus innocent and yet legally guilty, and how are we guilty yet legally innocent, and how does this legal fiction or this pronouncement allow God to forgive us? And all those are created because of that idea that retributive justice is an intrinsic attribute of God. It seems to me that is, and I like to ask Bill this because at several points you called it a caricature. But what you present as a caricature struck me as the form of penal substitution that I was taught, and that most of the people that I see is taught, like like the students I teach and stuff. And it's all about, here's an analogy that I was given, all right, when I was first a Christian. God's wrath, we were sinners and God was about to condemn us, send us to eternal hell because his justice must be satisfied. But Jesus, and a preacher actually did this, I'm not kidding, had a hammer and was going to smash this glass. And like the wrath of God was going to come down and crush us. But Jesus says, no, I'll take the brunt instead. And so he pulls out from behind the pulpit a cookie sheet, and the cookie sheet catches the hammer and vibrates. And that's how we now can go free. Since the justice was satisfied by punishing Jesus, it does need to be satisfied by punishing us for eternity. Though I will say I've never quite understood how his 30 or 36 hours on the cross or being dead is the just payment for eternal. If that, how does that satisfy God's justice? If justice demand that we would be damned eternally, the whole multitude. But that's a different issue. So. Is that a caricature, a complete caricature, Bill, or does that, the idea that Jesus absorbs the wrath that was destined for us?
Well, with that illustration that he just made of the glass and the hammer and the cookie sheet, I wonder if he went to an independent Baptist church in Michigan. It seems like I've never seen that illustration, but I guarantee you that was clear as day in my mind how that was done, because I've seen those kinds of illustrations done for all manner of things. But obviously he's posing a kind of a challenge to Gregg's position. But here's another challenge that could be brought up, right? In the spirit of fairness. Oh, by the way, I didn't do a bias check. I try to do that at the beginning of everything. All right, let me do it right now. We all have biases, all right? So throw your biases on the table. In fairness, I'm going to critique things probably from somewhat of a bias. It's almost impossible not to. My bias on this, I don't have necessarily a form of atonement that I necessarily hold to just yet, all right? I have things that I think work, right? I'll be honest. I'm partial to the Christus Victor model, right? But then again, I also think a lot of it can be harmonized together, and I'm not against PSA when properly articulated. And I may even have a foot in that camp and a foot in the Christus Victor camp and a foot in the moral influence camp. So I'm not going to necessarily I don't have a doctorate degree on PSA or Christus Victor or whatever else, and I'm dogmatically going after one of them. I'm very open to either one of these theories. But from imputation, you could make an argument from imputation, and that is, if Christ becomes our sacrifice, what does that look like? Now, Gregg has kind of this legal fiction that he's built out in some of his books, and that is, God in a court of law can hold Jesus accountable even though he didn't do it, right? But then you have strong versions of imputation. I mean, R.C. Sproul articulated that, and a lot of more fundamentalists, that Jesus becomes sin, right, on the cross. It mingles with his nature or something, or now I think that would be heretical, but in a less strong version of that, he's putting on coats, right? He's putting on these dirty coats. These are the coats of sin, right? And now the Father can look at Jesus and only see that and then turn his face away. Which, does that create a break in the Trinity? That's going to be a problem. I think in the hardline views, and I don't think Gregg goes that direction. But it is funny to me to hear Todd White, we all remember the Todd White bit where he's like, God became this on the tree. He became a child, and I'm not going to finish, but you can just go watch the clip. You can know what I'm going to say next. He became that on the tree. He became pornography on the tree. He became murder on the tree. All these things like this. He became these things, and the Reformed community lose their minds. Justin Peters loses his mind, and he's like, Todd White's a heretic, a heretic, a heretic, a heretic, and then go watch R.C. Sproul say the same thing. It's just funny. I mean, I don't have a dog in the fight, but like you go watch R.C. Sproul, who, to my knowledge, Justin Peter never called out as a false teacher, literally say the same thing, that Jesus becomes the quintessential obscenity on the cross. Like he becomes all this stuff on the cross. And when Todd White says it in a more childlike fashion, where he's actually breaking it down so that it doesn't go over your head in the erudite manner that R.C. Sproul said, like you say quintessential obscenity, you know, it goes over our heads. What does that mean? But Todd White breaks it down. He's like, that means this. And he's agreeing with him, and suddenly Todd White is being thrown to the wolves. You can, and by the way, you can throw Todd White to the wolves for a lot of other things, probably for fake healing, but you know, it is funny the double standard that exists in everybody's tradition, and a lot of times in the Reformed tradition as well. But that is a good thing you could parse out here. I say that a lot as well, man. I say parse out a lot, and I say to some degree. So, just comment in the comment section. Yeah, that Zach does that. All right, it just happens. But you to carry that thread of imputation and see where that ends up, right? Like, what is the mode of imputation? How is Christ taking on our sin? We need to be oh so careful that that does not somehow mingle with the nature of Christ. He does not become a sinner, right? But that, far be it from us to say that. Or that when God is punishing him, if that's really what's taking place, that there's no break in the Trinity. Because the Trinity is not three individual people disconnected from one another. Like that I'm not sure. I think that's a partialist perspective, or maybe partialism is the 33.4%. The Trinity is not just three separate people like Zach, John, and Dave. And, you know, Zach can turn away and Dave's over here and I can be punching Dave, right? They're more linked than that. So you could lead to Trinitarian problems and heresies if you take too strong of a view on imputation. So for those of you who've never heard other theories or may and have always affirmed PSA, those are some things you should work through that could be problems presented in this system of PSA. But for those of you who are just hardline anti-PSA advocates, there's also some things that could be brought against the other forms of atonement. Like the best one I can think of right now is ambiguity. There's a lot of ambiguity around the other atonement theories and what does what, right? That's up for a lot of debate. At least you can give this to PSA. PSA is a very neat package, right? It wraps it up. Like, things fit. Even if you think they're abominable, they fit. It makes sense of sacrificial systems. It makes sense of exactly what Jesus' purpose was, his death, you know, the resurrection. The resurrection not as much as Christus Victor. Christus Victor has a better model for the resurrection and why that was necessary, but it still does. Like, it's a neat system. It makes sense why so many people believe in it. In fact, the only other system I can think of that actually accounts for all the facts in a good way, or at least in a satisfactory way where it's not left up to ambiguity, is the moral influence theory, which most people think is the least adequate of all the theories. I'm not advocating moral influence or PSA, but I'm just saying those two at least seem to tie up the bow on things. They seem to tie up all the loose ends. Christus Victor, there's a lot of, okay, he died, but why? What means what, right? When you say he conquered these forces of evil, what mode, what mechanism, how did he do this stuff? Why was it necessary for him to die that way? But now PSA still has those critiques, but it at least harmonizes it well together. So that's to display no bias there and try and put challenges to both sides. Those are things that could be brought up.
I would agree with you, Gregg, that God the Father does not vent his wrath upon Jesus. Rather, what he expresses is the just punishment for our sins. And here's why these legal motifs are so important. It's not that God is just emotionally angry. It's rather that we are guilty of capital offenses. We are like criminals who have committed capital crimes and whose just desert is death. But God, out of his tremendous love for us, says, I will become incarnate and bear the death penalty for sin that you deserved so that you can go free and be cleansed and forgiven. So the incarnation and atonement of Christ is the supreme act of self-giving sacrifice on the part of God. It shows God's tremendous love for us, as well as his holiness and righteousness, which demands punishment for sin justly deserved.
Can you get on board with that, Greg?
It's that odd experience I had reading this book. Verbally, I can, but I frame it differently. Like in James, when it says that each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, gives birth to death. Okay, so that's kind of the relationship between punishment and sin is the relationship between conception and birth. If that being the case, what do you add to it by saying, "Oh, now God also has to punish"? It's there. There's nothing more for God to do, is there?
Well, I think that what
yeah, there it is again, right? What more is added there? There's already a natural punishment for sin. The wages of sin are death. That's what Greg Boyd is saying. The gift of God's eternal life. So what more needs to be added there? Why does God also need to get his pound of flesh, basically? Why does he need to extract something further? Because sin already is leading us into separation from God. Now, on Craig's point, he's saying God's holy and God's just, and when you sin, you're sinning against him, right? And against holiness and against so justice comes into the equation, and Jesus takes that, obviously, but God is concerned with punishment. So for instance, if somebody kills your grandmother, God is concerned with that injustice, right? He cares about injustice, and you can see that all throughout the Old Testament and a lot of motifs that are presented there about God being angry with people who abuse the poor and the widow and the orphans and exacting justice against people. You even find that throughout, the various slaughters of people like the Canaanites, right? That God is just. And so there's two sides of this coin, but as Greg Boyd is pointing out, why does there need to be this other auxiliary punishment when death is already our punishment, right? We're already going to be punished for sin just naturally, organically, and Jesus comes to save us from that. Why does there further need to be this other thing? And I think you'd also argue that adding this other thing adds in a lot of other problems that we need to now solve on innocence, and how can the innocent pay for the guilty legally, and the judge call that, that debt paid for, right? And I guess probably you could bring up, even in our own court system, that doesn't happen, right? I can't say, hey, I want to pay the crime for the murderer, and the judge will say, okay, well, the murderer can go free if you sit in jail. Like, no, that won't work. You pay for your own sin. Now, I get it. It's an exceptional case in PSA, obviously. So everyone would say, yeah, it's an exceptional case. That's why it's such a beautiful case. He pays for our sin. He comes down innocent for the guilty, and it's in that story, how beautiful is that? But I think that the beauty of that can also be applied to the Christus Victor model, and even the moral influence model, by the way. I get it, and I've said this a while because I think a lot of people caricature the position, but the moral influence model, even in what it says, and there are some weaknesses to the model, Jesus still comes and Jesus still dies a gruesome and painful death to show us a better way, right? Now, the death doesn't seem like it has as much writing on it, but I think it does if you really wanted to articulate the theory like it should be, and like scholarship would, who support it. But there is beauty outside of penal substitution in these other atonement models. Now, I'm not getting on which one's right or wrong, but I am pointing that out because I think that we need to foster an environment where Christians can discuss these things and not be concerned about being called heretics, because there's a lot, especially on atonement, there's a lot of YouTube channels out there and YouTube personalities out there who are very quick to call heretic towards everybody and their brother, and their mother and their cousin and their sister for coming down differently. So even if you're wrong, I think we should still talk over these important issues on atonement.
What you add is a more adequate biblical view. As I said, these legal motifs suffuse Judaism, and they feature front and center in the book of Romans. I'm not even sure that in the book of James, that James is not talking about death there as a penalty for sin rather than a consequence. I think it's both. It's both a consequence and a penalty, and we shouldn't try to make this an either or. It's a both and, I would say. Good. Then do you have room in your atonement theory for the idea that Christ bore the suffering that would have been our punishment had it been inflicted on us, thereby releasing us from liability to punishment?
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
Completely.
And I
But see, I understand
my view.
But the difference for me in this debate is
Bill
who's
just
doing
goes
the
a step
punishing
further.
in a sense,
Yeah,
because I get the
exactly.
sense from you, Greg, that this is an organic form of punishment. You say it's not God doing the punishment; it's sin is its own punishment. But Bill,
it's a divine punishment, and that God created this moral order.
right. But Bill, do you see God as having a sort of direct role in punishing either people or Jesus?
Well, yes,
for the sin?
I think that the fact that God's justice in the New Testament is in large measure what is called retributive justice, according to which the guilty deserve punishment. The fact that God's justice is retributive, I think, is so clear in that it's eschatological. That is to say,
to me, coding is this feeling of balance between you and the computer. You have
Guys,
the
what are you gonna
creativity
do?
of
people are punished in the afterlife. They experience eternal separation from God, or, if you will, annihilation, depending on your view. But in any case, at that point, it's too late for punishment to serve purposes of rehabilitation or deterrence or other goods that are visualized by a consequentialist theory of justice. Eschatological justice can only be, it seems to me, retributive in nature. And so this shows that the demands of God's retributive justice.
But that kind of seems like a bit of a non sequitur, though, because no one's arguing. The understanding that I have that what's being argued here is, and follow this line of logic, the wages of sin are death. Sin separates you from God. If you sin, you're separated from God. To be right with God, you need something to intervene on your behalf. Let's say that, okay? And by the way, that's still in line with PSA right now. But right, if you sin, right, you're walking down the path of sin. You're walking down the path of death, right? So when you die and you go to what could be an eternal, either if you affirm annihilationism or ETC, which is eternal conscious torment, right? You're walking down that path, you die, you are in hell, right? However you want to frame hell, we'll get into that some other time, right? But hell is death, right? It's separation from God. What is hell if it's not a place where God is not, right? You're separated from God for eternity, or you're annihilated. But wouldn't that be the just consequences of your sin? If that makes sense. Like, it's not that God doesn't need to, in that, you could argue that God doesn't need to hold the doors of hell closed, right? I mean, you could take the C.S. Lewis view, and that is hell is a door locked from the inside, right? And the people who are in hell are people who are not repentant anyway, right? They're so addicted to their sin, they'd never leave, basically, right? It's become their entire being. So the sin that they participated in reality on earth, they drop off into hell, they continue to participate in that sin, right? And they continue to be a slave to it, and they're addicted to it. So that judgment is not necessarily, you wouldn't have to argue that God is punishing them as much as they are still punishing themselves. They separated themselves from God, and they're continuing that trail of being separated from God. So that doesn't need to be looked at. It's very possible to not look at it as a punishment that God is giving to people as much as it's an organic punishment, again, of them, right? They are organically suffering separation from God because they organically will not repent. Now, I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but I am saying that it's possible to take that theory, and in that case, the point that Dr. Gregg is making is not actually that good of a point, because you don't have to affirm that that is a form of retributive punishment, or that it's a form of rehabilitative punishment, or that it's any of these kind of, it's not meant to rehabilitate, it's just a natural consequence of your rejecting of God, right? It's just another step in your separation from God. And you don't need to think of it as kind of the framing that he just put on it. And let's do one more clip here, guys.
Are satisfied, I think, by Christ's bearing the punishment for sin that we deserved.
What's your take on retributive justice then, Gregg?
If God is love, and that's the essence of God, and I think Bill agrees with that, I'm wondering how retributive justice can be. It seems to me if God is love, everything God does is an expression of God's love. And I just have never understood why. See, it comes down to why is sin sin? And it seems, I would argue, sin is sin, and God hates sin. I agree with what Bill said about God's hatred towards sin, but he hates it because it kills us. And he loves us. So it's the law isn't it's not something in and of itself. It's there in service to something more fundamental, and that's why I think framing it. See, when you frame everything in a legal way, it almost seems like you turn a love story into a legal story, and you do talk about the love of God, and you even get excited about it, and I got excited about it with you. But then there's all these legal, the whole book's on these legal terminology, and I was amazed at how you dug into these court cases going back to the 18th century, and showing analogies about how, an innocent person could be guilty or whatever. You've got way more patience and time than I do, because I could not wade through that stuff. But see, that all comes because it's framed primarily as a legal problem. The atonement's like a legal problem. And for me, it's, the whole thing comes down to the bridegroom, his betrothed bride has gotten kidnapped and seduced by this evil person who's intent on killing her. And so God does everything that could possibly be done, going to the full extent of the cross, whatever, to then free her from that seducer, and to woo her back and win her back and restore her. That's the core love story that I see going on with the atonement. And it's got legal dimensions to it, but if that becomes the center, then it seems to me you've turned it. This is where I disagree with you, Bill, that we should see the forgiveness that comes about as a result of the cross as primarily a pardon, a legal pardon from a king. So my friend Paul Eddy pointed this out. It turned me on to some articles that had shown that some of the most ferocious judicial language is used.
Okay, so I mean, that's gonna sum up basically where they're just gonna go to another place unless you guys want to be here for another 2 hours. But what I will say to end this off is basically this: one. And I think we all can affirm this. The Christus Victor's model, or Christus Victor model, is a beautiful model. It really is. I don't think that the PSA model is ugly. Some people do. But, again, most people would say you can merge the two together. So, if you come here and you're like, I really believe in PSA, I wouldn't just mobilize against Christus Victor, right? Listen to what it has to say, because you can actually incorporate it into your model, right? Or if you're Christus Victor, again, listen to what PSA has to say, but I understand there actually are distinctions in those two systems. We can't just merge everything together and be like, yeah. Like, if you want to have a hardline version of PSA or a hardline version of Christus Victor, especially Christus Victor and a couple other theories as well, you're not really going to be able to mix PSA with it. But there's a beauty in all the systems, right? The way that they're articulated. Now, there's also potential problems inside all of the systems. It's atonement. It's really hard to understand this stuff, guys. But again, one thing that we pointed out in Craig's conversation with Alex O'Connor is he's a philosopher. One of my favorites, man, he's in my top 3 of favorite apologists, but he's a philosopher. So a lot of times he kind of, will get to the logical essence of things and kind of forget about the emotionalism of things. And emotionalism, your ethos sells, right? You got pathos, logos, and ethos, right? And your ethos sells a lot of what you're saying, and you can tell Gregg Boyd's passion for what he's saying. It wins a lot of people over. And be honest, in the context of the full thing, I do think that he builds out a better case. But maybe not a better logical case. I'd say that he wins the debate, though, if there was a debate, based on the picture he's painting and kind of his passion for that picture. And that doesn't make him right or wrong, but I would say those are things, if you want to persuade, to incorporate into your own persuasion tactics, right? Get a passion for something, man. Paint a beautiful story, right? Paint how gorgeous, and for PSA people, paint your story. Paint how beautiful you think your story is. Paint, all of the intricacies of Christ coming, the innocent for the guilty, right? And the wrath of God, but paint it in a way that people will hear it and be persuaded and attracted to it. Because I'm not saying you're devoid of that, but a lot of times PSA people will just argue specifically on fact and scripture and neglect the ethos of things. And Christus Victor right now, I think, is winning this culture war, if you want to call it, or this religious war, mainly because its advocates are advocating so passionately and making what are very good cases for the love of God. Now, also, that's not to say one is right or wrong, but that is some good generalistic advice, I think. Again, I don't have a dog necessarily in the fight. I know that there's potential problems in everybody's theories, but again, I'm going to say again. It's late. Woo! Please be nice in the comment section. Tell me what your view is. If you hold to any of these views, put down what you think. Or if you hold to a multiplicity of views, put down in the comment section what you think, and we will, in good faith, we will try to engage you, and hopefully we can get more good constructive dialogue on these difficult topics. But please subscribe and like the video, and we will see you in the next one.